All right, let's talk about dirt. So, focusing on soils. Soils are actually incredibly important for the environment. It's where we grow our food. But soils take a long time to form. You end up starting with regular rock, and then over time what we have is weathering. We have physical weathering, where we break down the rock into smaller particles. You have chemical reactions, or chemical weathering. We have biological weathering as well. And so, it takes an incredibly long time for us to go from rock to soil, and soil that you can use to grow crops in. And the sad thing is that this soil can all be lost overnight. And so rocks, remember these rocks are made of minerals, and these are recycled on our own planet using the rock cycle. They can undergo weathering, both physical and chemical. And that weathering produces the particles in the soil. It makes up about half of the soil that we have. We also have the biosphere contributing life. You've got the atmosphere and the hydrosphere. And also you have an incredibly long period of time. And so all of these together contribute to creating soil. You're going to have lots of different types of soil on our planet. One way to look at how we classify soil is to look at the different horizons or the layers that are present in soil. You can also look at the particle size in the soil. Going from large particles to small, it goes from sand to silt to clay. Now, that contributes to the porosity of the soil. How easy is it for water to get down and bring water and nutrients to the roots of the plant? And then we also have the chemistry of the soil. Where did the parent rock come from? And one of the big things that's really important in the chemistry of soil is the CEC, or the cation exchange capacity. How easily does that soil deliver important ions to the roots themselves? Now, conservation is incredibly important with soils. We have soil erosion, where we are physically removing the soil. And then we also have salinization, or salting of the soil, which is contributing to soil loss. So on Earth, remember, we have a rock cycle, where we can move from igneous rock, which are crystallized magma, to sedimentary rock. Now, we have this weathering, and erosion moves it, and then we have this compaction that forms a sedimentary rock, like sandstone. And then we can have metamorphism, where we are actually putting heat and pressure on rocks to convert it into a metamorphic rock. But it's that weathering that contributes to our soils. The first type of weathering is going to be physical weathering. This is an example of so if you take a look at a bunch of different rocks, you can kind of see that some of these are going to be broken apart. And that's due to water. It could be ice wedging that splits and breaks the rock apart. It could also be the roots of a plant that mechanically separate and split the rock. This increases the surface area of the rock. In other words, anything that physically breaks a rock down into smaller bits, that's going to be physical weathering. And that's only half of it. You also have chemical weathering. Now, on some rocks you can see that there's going to be rust or oxidation going on. And you can see that on the outside, the surface of the rock. And so these chemical reactions can break down a rock into particles of the soil over a long period of time. If you look at granite, you can have feldspar that will react with naturally forming acids, and it can form something called clay. And you could talk about the importance of clay in a little bit. I'll get to that. Now, we could talk about soil being three separate phases that come together. You have solid, liquid, and gas. If you look at the solid phase, you're going to have the minerals of the soil itself. So that really, these are the particles that come from the parent rock. And we also have organic materials in it. The organic material is the living material. So roots are an example, and you have dead material too. You also have the hydrosphere. So water comes into the system. And then you're going to have air. So now, this is how breakdown contributes to the soil. It's going to differ a lot based on what type of soil you've got. But if you think about it, what really is soil? It's the coming together of the lithosphere, or the earth on our planet. It's also the air, or the atmosphere, and the hydrosphere, water. And then it's where we're going to head further on as we talk a little bit more. It's the biosphere itself, all living material. And that's why soil is really kind of important. It's at this interface between all these different spheres, all these different parts of our planet. And if you look at how soil is formed, bedrock is broken down. It's weathered over time. And eventually, you get what's called the horizons of the soil. Now, you can classify some of the major soil horizons. At the top, what you're going to have is called the O horizon. That's going to be the organic matter, the stuff that's living or was recently living. That's where you're going to have a lot of mix of living, dead, or dying material. Below that, you're going to have the A horizon. That's going to be your topsoil. That's going to be a really good mix of minerals, and it also has all of the organics from the horizon above. As we go below that, you're going to the B horizon, and that's the subsoil. There's not a whole lot of organics found in the subsoil. You're still going to have minerals and nutrients that are getting pushed from the soil layers above. And then finally you get down to, the sea level and the sea horizon. And that's going to be where you have parent rock. And that can be pretty deep in some areas. Now, in certain soil horizons, we also have an E horizon. And that's called as if there's alluviation taking place. In other words, you have the movement of water down. It's pulling the minerals out of those soil layers above. And you're just left with sand and silt, kind of this dry layer. Particle size contributes a lot to what type of soil we're talking about. So you can take a look at like a loam. So if you look at a loam type of soil, it's going to have a lot of varying sizes. So you can go from very big, like boulders, to gravel. But eventually, you want to get to the level of soil where you have sand. Sand's going to be relatively large in the soil. You can then have silt, and you can finally get to clay particles. Clay is going to be particles that are smaller than, say 1/10 of a millimeter. So really, really, really fine particles. Now, what do those particles really contribute to? It's the type of the soil and the porosity of that soil. So let's say we take, those 3 different types of particles, and you can fill a container up with sand, silt, and clay. And you then add water. Well, you can imagine what could happen. In a container that has sand in it, it's going to drain out. And you're going to have very high porosity, so the water can pass through the sand. And that's going to take hours. In the silt, it's going to take days for the water to drain out. And in clay, it could take years for the water to drain out. And so having a lot of clay can really stifle the movement of water into pores where roots really need it. So you can classify soil based on what types of particles you have. And it can take a little while to get used to this. So you'll have clay on one side, and this could be, you could have silt on the other side, and then you can also have sand. So the particle size of sand, the particles of sand are the largest. Then there's silt, and then there's clay. And depending upon the percent of clay, as it increases, eventually you simply call something clay. You're not going to have a lot of good drainage with that. And it's not going to be a really good place to grow crops when you have a lot of clay. So what's the perfect type of soil? Well, you want to have a good mix of clay and a certain percentage of sand and silt to create a good loam. And that's going to be a nice balance of all particle sizes. Now, clay is very important. If you look at the cation exchange capacity, you got to ask yourself, what is that? That's the ability of a soil to really deliver important ions, important nutrients to the roots themselves. And the more clay you have, now at the microscopic level, this is very important. And all the more organics that you have, they're going to be attracting those cations, and they're going to deliver all of this energy, the cations, to the roots themselves. Another important property of soil that goes along with the cation exchange capacity is going to be the base saturation. So think about how these minerals can buffer the acidity of the soil, and because that acidity can really damage plants. Soil conservation is incredibly important. It takes hundreds of years to create and form these different types of soils, and you can turn all this around overnight. So you're going to end up with things like soil erosion, where we're rinsing off the top layer of soil. And as a farmer, you'd really want to limit and mediate that. You can also have soil compaction. That's when if the soils are wet and you drive on it with really heavy machinery, that weighs it down. And what you can do is you can compact those pores in the soil, and that can destroy the soil in the same way. You also have salinization, and you increase the level of salt in the soil. So if you have plants growing on top of the soil, they could eventually draw some of the water out. And you want to be able to leave some of the natural salts behind. Normally, it's not a problem because you're going to have a lot of rainwater. Rainwater is fresh water. And as that rainwater comes down, it pushes a lot of the salts out of the soil. So it's not really going to damage crops. Now, what's the big problem with this? Well, if you start to irrigate the land, you have a different result. So you have to start using irrigations in some areas, and you're going to spray water on the crops. Where's that water coming from? Well, it's not coming from the sky. It's water that's coming from the soil itself. And you're probably pumping it up out of the ground. What does that mean? Well, it means that the little droplets that are in the irrigation water are actually going to have salts inside it already. So when you go to the land and you start to irrigate it, you go to the lands on the field and you're going to increase the level of salt to the point where you can't really grow crops on it anymore. So how can you solve this problem of salinization, of too much salt in your soil? You could try to flush it out with a whole lot of fresh water. You can also change the type of crops that you have. You can find crops that are more salt tolerant. Or you can use crops that have really big root systems so that they can push that salt further down. But you can kind of see where I'm going. It's this idea that soil is a non-renewable resource. It has a capacity, and if you push it too far, you have problems. It takes a very long time for soil to form, and it is really very hard to balance the proper chemistry and particle size in the soil. So if you take a look at the Earth itself, you have a lot of areas on our planet where soil loss is incredibly vulnerable. Think of a desert. And it's very important for us that we try to conserve our soil. So take some time to think about this issue. There are a lot of problems with salinization and damage. And now, when you get to rocks and minerals, to see whether or not they're weathered, there's both these physical and chemical modifications to rocks that eventually produce soil. Along with the atmosphere, the biosphere, and the hydrosphere, all these things work together, and it takes a lot of time to weather soil. And soils can be characterized by the horizons or their different levels. Remember, you have at the top type O, then A, and then sometimes E, then B, and C horizons. You have particle size, sand, silt, and clay, clay being the very smallest. And all of this leads to the porosity of the soil. And you also have to remember the chemistry of the soil. Cation exchange capacity, or CEC, is incredibly important. Think of all of these basics with some of the background on soil types and how it can affect both crops and the ecosystem.